When we looked at Chapter 1, discussing the present American Southwest, I offered two terms which I think are still important for us in this talk. The first is ethnogenesis, the idea that struck by disease and violence, affected indigenous communities actively worked to regroup, reform, migrate, and change their politics, cultures, and even ethnicities in response. It was a matter of survival, but it was also one of conscious strategy. Similarly, I mentioned indigenous settler colonialism, how some natives, also strategizing for a variety of reasons, adopted white settler tactics to improve their own opportunities for survival and even growth. Now, as we turn to the American Northeast and the early European colonies, we will see some of these changes close up, this time in economics. Now, it's not for me to repeat here everything we've learned in our public schooling about the American colonies. I'll just point out right now that this too is a story told as if a single European culture was at work building its communities with occasional visits, assistance, and ultimately violence from the native tribes. Obviously, no. The region was variously populated, active and dynamic, even as European disease and conflict soon reduced its numbers. But in the Northeast, we'll start with a desperate European explorer strategy at work, a militarized slaving. It was soon obvious to the various indigenous peoples that the colonists had superior technology, especially in metals and guns. But the earlier explorers and mariners, mostly folks completely unprepared for wilderness survival, were simply desperate for labor to build any footholds here. But rather than seize the natives themselves, far easier to outsource it, make their guns into a kind of currency. Guns for violently captured slaves. Some of the tribes agree. Now, I mentioned that the Europeans were unprepared. Did I mention that they were unprepared because many had never before had to provide for themselves or do genuine labor? Once the first explorers and later colonists began to understand what was needed for survival and growth, why, then it was simply a matter of finding servants, or slaves, to do it. Now, I should mention that this trade happened in an environment where some tribes were in tension or conflict with others. Up to now, these conflicts were relatively small scale, resource or family rooted perhaps, even if long enduring. But with guns, both the imbalance and lethality of intertribal conflicts escalates quickly, while captured natives are delivered into the hands of the Europeans. Where peace had often held, European trade demands ended it. And so, this became part of the economic engine that grew colonies and decimated the surrounding tribes. In exchange for more guns and other manufactured goods, indigenous nations had to provide captured slaves. Slaves they would take from the competing tribes. And since those tribes also had guns, getting more guns for defense was necessary. So the trade was self-fulfilling. This, of course, increased further the size and violence of those conflicts and created new ones. In other words, tribes were compelled to capture and trade other native people as a strategy for survival, even while this contributed to the weakening of all. Should I mention that it wasn't long before these native slaves became a colonial export, and not a small one? Undoubtedly, we might imagine that a combination of factors then brought about indigenous cultural collapse. But again, no. That is a European story, a settler myth. Instead, in a version of ethnogenesis, the tribes well understood the trap that they were in. They began to form coalescent societies, merging various broken peoples and refugees into entirely new political groups. Some of these were strong enough to survive the struggle of their own regional escape as refugees and form what were called new towns further inland, entirely new merged cultures and traditions. Others, though, ended up forming alliances which contended powerfully with the colonists themselves. This will be true of the Catawbas and Wyandots, for instance. What we have then is a wide range of native communities up and down the Atlantic coast, each vying in a balancing act between the surviving colonists from several European countries and the varying political struggles between themselves. Communicating, negotiating, responding to the changing demands and regional shifts of the settler colonies became imperative. Fortunately, a system for this was already in place. And so this leads to the last term we need to talk about today, one hugely misunderstood and misused through the European historical point of view. Tribes communicated with each other to solidify alliances, relate histories, establish laws and protocols, communicate trade agreements, and reinforce defenses against colonial manipulation. This was done through a sophisticated craftwork of beads that was called wampum. Now, right away, we might think, oh yes, wampum, that's Indian money. But hold on. It's best if we think of it first as a legal or diplomatic communication, so we can understand just how colonial economies worked. Once the Europeans arrived and understood the complex and necessary tool of wampum tradition at work, it was the Europeans who were forced to adopt it if they also wanted to participate in regional politics. And so they did. As we will see, this was only one indigenous concept that colonists incorporated. But for European minds, the uses to which wampum might be put were a bit different. Remember, we just talked about the needs of native peoples to acquire European technology if they wish to compete with neighbors and the colonists themselves. And if the trap of this trade system, which created indigenous slaves, was understood by the tribes, it was certainly understood by the colonists themselves. Economics is economics. Everything could be commodified, turned into an item of economic value and therefore new political power. And the Europeans were also in conflict themselves over the spoils of North America. The Dutch dominated the English in fur trade, for instance, and the Puritans and others needed some kind of trade currency to compete. So they encouraged, then demanded wampum payments from local indigenous peoples as tribute. Not only did this become a kind of universal currency for the white settlers then, across the national and territorial boundaries, it also worked on the indigenous tribes to create first economic dependency and then debt. This was debt that could be leveraged against the tribes later in exchange for more land. In other words, a traditional device of culture and diplomacy became the means to purchase, and yes, I mean steal, native land. That was the predatory economic reality of British North America. All this was an economic reasoning that the native peoples had not before encountered or understood. Soon enough, though, it would be.